think one of the big achievements of tech, and I started using it in 1988, 89 on a primitive machine. Well, it was a IBM AT, so at least it wasn't an 8086, it was an 8286. Is that it will give satisfactory performance on such minimal hardware that I could run it on a machine that ran I think it took 5 to 10 seconds a page, I can't remember, to typeset my papers, and that was a 1 megahertz machine, and the machines now are 5,000 times faster.
Interestingly, Donald Knuth is credited with the quote that premature optimization is the root of all evil. And but with tech, he worked extremely hard to produce efficient algorithms, and he went even further. For a period of several months while tech was in use at Stanford, they ran an instrumented version of it that counted up the number of times each line of the code was reached. And so based on a substantial body of use from people in different fields at Stanford, he was able to understand which are the really time critical parts of tech and go back and revisit them. And that led to a really remarkable engine. These days, I think in the word processor world, they probably don't think much about that problem because people are working, typing away, expecting the current page to be rendered, but not thinking about what's happening with the other pages.
I think regarding accessibility, we've got a problem of great complexity, and finding simple subproblems that are more amenable to solutions, and finding ways of dividing the complexity will, I think, be quite important. This is not something that one person can do. This is a big challenge, and it's not a technical piece of programming, although there's a very strong technical aspect to it. It's a user experience. User experience is really important in terms of accessibility. So the mobile phones, and Apple, the big leader on this, have a fantastic user experience, at least for most people. And a lot of effort is put into that. And I think it's significant that, if I'm right, the head person in Apple now ascended the ranks as a designer and not as a algorithms expert or whatever. Whereas in the early days of Apple, it was people like Wozniak who could do miracles on limited hardware. So I think that the solution to our accessibility problems will depend to some extent on advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence and all sorts of other things. But I think a lot of it will be a mixture of common sense and building a community of practice. I think that's going to be the really hard thing, or the thing that I don't know how to do.
I probably should mention here that there's been a significant development in the last year or two in the LaTeX world with the LaTeX 3 team. They have been very busy adding a feature into both LaTeX 2e and LaTeX 3 called hooks. The notion of a hook is that you can say, at the beginning of this environment, execute this code, at the end of it, execute this other code. And you can even get into finer grain. So you can say, at the beginning of the begin environment, do this. At the end of the begin environment, do that, and so on for the end environment. And one thing this allows you to do is, if you decided you needed markup in the DVI file or the PDF file to mark the start of a color region or a section heading or whatever, you now have an easy way to do it that doesn't require going in and modifying the low-level macros, which is always fraught with peril because sometimes their definitions change at the next release. So this is a feature I wanted 30 years ago when I was using tech in the 80s in LaTeX, because I often found that I wanted to do almost what the section heading macro did, but something slightly different. And the only way to do the different thing was to define how that macro was implemented and make personal modifications. So hooks, I think, are a big advance. They've existed in a few programming languages, notably Lisp, for decades, but they haven't commonly been available in the typesetting world, and nor have they been exploited by most macro package writers. But I think over the next short number of years, we'll see more macro package writers going back and revisiting their code and deciding that, gee, I could implement this much more easily now that there's a standard way to have a hook applied.
We'll have to see. I wonder if it's something that needed to happen some time ago. And I feel that not many people are writing tech macros now, and that just as not many people are writing PostScript now. So that's my prejudice coming through. I don't have any evidence for it.
Right. Well, see, what I was thinking of is, there are there are tens of millions of lines of code in LaTeX and tech macro packages, and the average user is never going to look inside those. But as we understand the need for new features in the output stream, such as properly marking things like sectional headings, captions, and figure references, tables, and so on, those macros can be modified by the experts in the field, and users instantly benefit from it. I mean, it isn't known how many people around the world are using tech, but it's believed to be in the millions. There are certainly companies in different countries that make a decent living from producing documents in these languages. There are telephone books in several countries have been typeset by tech, and so on. So it doesn't have to be at the end user that these things have to be known about. It's only the people who are writing the macro packages who need to know about them. But if users find out about a hook feature, they may say, gee, there's something I've always wanted to do that I couldn't do before. And now hooks make that extremely easy.
I think I'll let Jonathan Godfrey have the last word. And as he's not here, I'm going to have to repeat what he said, which is the solution that will win is the one that minimizes alteration to common practice by users. I'll add the proviso to that. If a solution actually improves common practice that gives benefits to users, that's also a big plus. Third, a solution that makes the user's life easier rather than harder has got a great advantage. And then he says, if everything is done under the hood, then the above reality check is immaterial. I believe the improvements in access will come because authors, who are ordinary people, don't need to think about access because it's got built in for them. So in some sense, we want an automated process that not only produces beautifully typeset material, but also accessible material. And we don't have to worry about the hyphenation and justification coming out right when we use tech. And we want a system where we don't have to worry about the accessibility coming out right. And if we start with a big document and a big complex document, we've got a big complex problem. So if we can find some small problems to start with that really help people, that's where I would like to be starting. The simplest problems we can solve that haven't been solved already, that help people, is where to start. And we have to have an eye on the big problems.
Can I ask a question of Sanjit? What is ASL?
ASL.
ASL might be American Sign Language.
American
That's
Sign
one.
Language, I would think, yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, so what about someone who can't see then? Do they use something like Audible to, to render text into, so they can hear all right, into audible form? Well, what do they do at the moment, especially with the mathematics? Can it be made into an audible form, or does it have to go to what do you call it? The feeling side of it. Sorry,
Braille.
Braille. Yes, that's right.
Well, certainly tech can be made audible, and I've in previous gatherings of this little group, I mentioned T.V. Raman, who did his PhD at Cornell on a system called ASTER, ASTER, which stood for Audio System for Technically Enhanced Reading. That was a landmark piece of work, and earned him the ACM Doctoral Dissertation of the Year award. But I don't know, however, to what extent casual users are using these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. So we just had a comment about Braille is difficult. So yes, I suppose Audible might be a good way of getting around that.
I've heard Jonathan Godfrey say that he prefers Audible most of the time, but if he has to check, for example, that it's a period rather than a comma or something like that, sort of niceties of syntax.
Mm-hmm.
The Braille is very good for checking niceties of syntax because it has that resolution that Audible doesn't.
Okay, thank you.
There are problems with complex material that, particularly navigation, as I understand it, and another problem with complex material is short-term memory. So I can glance at my notes and refresh my short-term memory. And I can glance at the screen and remember the last command I did. Whereas somebody who's blind doesn't have that easy facility to refresh and reinforce short-term memory.
Yes, I see. Somebody was just saying about syntax, so that would also cover that problem. Sorry, did he say syntax or context? I was thinking context, but he said syntax.
Yes, when we read, we tend to pick up things from context.
Mm.
And somehow there's what's the word? There's a lot of contextual understanding in communication. And if you turn traffic lights upside down, they're impossible to use. If you write the letter red in a blue color, it's impossible to say.
And some jokes are very subtle, aren't they? Play of words and so on.
Yeah. So that context thing is quite important in the translation, and we have to solve the problems where we can. And it's only a real hero or a complete fool who can go into an area and say, oh, we have to solve this problem and I'll solve it. Most of us are much more limited in that. And make the best of what there is my usual advice in this sort of situation. Are we making the best of what there is? How can we do better?